as someone mentioned, it is a real shame that we encounter technical issues when we're having an event of on such a vital topic. And I really hope, and in fact, I don't need to hope because I'm convinced of it, that the content of the event will make up for the loss of time. Here's what we're going to do. First things first, we're recording the event. Everything will be sent out afterwards. We have a Facebook Live streaming link that is being sent to everybody, and the whole event will be streamed live on Facebook. Those of you who are with us, hopefully you'll be able to stay with us. If you need to leave at any point, obviously you will get the recording and you can come back in. Just people that you know who can't get in, send them the Facebook Live link. We've just put it in the chat box. What we're going to do, we're going to run Amate's session till 10:20. Then we're going to have Jason and Paulette, and we're going to run into the break a little bit, only to the extent that they're actually able to stay with us, because I don't want to take up their time if they've got other commitments. But we'll try and pack it all in as best we can and gain back the time in the scheduled break. This event is about acknowledging that none of us have done enough on tackling racism across higher education, and coming away with a plan of action to do more. If everyone who expressed interest in this event attended did just one thing in their institution or in their particular context, the scale of change would be absolutely enormous. So we really, really hope that what you will come away with is a kind of things that you can do to make a real difference wherever you are. A few very quick housekeeping notes. Feel free to post to the chat box, but do be aware, because it's quite well attended, we won't necessarily be able to pick up questions that way. So if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. Feel free to uprate questions if you want them more answered than others, so that we can kind of pick up the ones that are most popular. And the Wonkhe team is in the chat, so if you have any issues, do direct a message to them. That's me, Mark, Jim and DK. And now it only remains for me to introduce Amate. Amate is known to many of you as a former Vice President of Higher Education at NUS, and for his national advocacy for universities to take action on closing the BAME attainment gap, which has culminated in the influential Closing the Gap report with Universities UK. He's now a consultant with NICE Group, and he's given up his personal time to co-produce and host this event, for which we're incredibly grateful. Do continue, by the way, to keep posting your resources in the chat box, and I am collating them, and I will share those afterwards. Amate is going to open the event with his own insight on what a whole university approach to tackling racism might look like. So thank you very much, Amate, and over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Debbie, and hopefully everybody can see my screen. This is a very timely and important event, and I'm really pleased that so many of you are joining us today. As we said, we're going to have to move some of the timings around, but looking forward to a really engaging conversation this morning. Just a brief introduction to myself. As Debbie said, I'm Amate. I'm a consultant at NOUS Group. On the right, you can see a bit of work that NOUS does. NOUS is an Australian consulting firm with over 20 years of experience in higher education. And in the time that I've been at NOUS, I've worked with a number of universities on a whole range of projects. But before that, I was Vice President of Higher Education at the National Union of Students, and in that role co-chaired the NUS UK Closing the Gap report, which looked into tackling the BME attainment gap. So lots of really interesting stuff there, and a lot of that informs my talk today. You've got my email address if you do want to get in touch, and also my Twitter in between tweeting memes. I occasionally have something interesting to say about higher education policy, so please do give that a follow, and obviously do engage in the conversation today. So let's just kick things off. As I said, this is a timely discussion, a timely conversation. The murder of George Floyd in America sent shockwaves around the world, and have sparked lots of conversations, and lots of institutions and organizations and governments have taken various forms of action. On a personal note, there is something, I'm trying to find the right word, in a sense despairing about the fact that it takes a black person to die before these events these issues are surfaced in this way. But I think we shouldn't miss this chance, really, to look at all the ways in which Black lives are discriminated against and structurally disadvantaged across the West, and ask ourselves those real searching questions about what we can do to change. And this is a conversation for many sectors. This is a conversation today for higher education, and I'm glad that so many people have turned out for this conversation. So as Debbie said, what we'll cover today, I'll kick off by whizzing through some high-level thoughts about the importance of taking a whole institution approach to tackling racism. I'll then hand over to some fantastic speakers that we have today, and look at some of the three other areas. So we'll be looking at studying and working in academic communities, we'll be looking at intersections, capturing and acting on lived experience, and then we'll be looking at leadership. There will be a short break between 2 and 3. And as we've said before, please do join us on the conversation on Twitter, #BlackLivesMatterHE, and let's keep the conversation going, not just for this morning, but beyond as well. So I'm just going to kick things off by saying, talking about the importance of taking a whole institution approach to tackling racism and why that's so important. The first thing is to say is to start off in a slightly provocative space, and is to say that universities have played a critical role in the creation of race as a concept. I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to look at the university sector like other sectors and say, look, there's racism that exists in wider society and universities are not immune to that, so we need to do something to address that. But sometimes that doesn't quite acknowledge the nuance, which is that actually universities were involved in the creation of race as a concept. It produced academics and thinkers who created lots of these racial hierarchies, which in turn provided the intellectual underpinnings for colonialism and slavery. And on the right of the PowerPoint, you can see at the top an academic called Blumenbach sketching out 5 different skulls, which we know to be obviously fictitious today, but 5 different skulls that were to signify 5 different races. And we've got Immanuel Kant, again revered as one of the founding fathers in philosophy, but he too in 1775, I think it was, in a piece called The Different Races of Man, also espoused lots of set out different races and said why they were different, and ordered them in a certain hierarchy. So it's really, really important that not only are there issues to do with race and to do with racial inequality in higher education, the sector unfortunately played a role in their creation. But the other thing to say is, I'm sure many of you are at institutions where you would say that your institution wasn't around at that time, and that's a valid point. But it's important to understand that the sector today came out of that ecosystem. We're all part of the same ecosystem. There are lots of legacies that continue today, which I'll touch on briefly. So what are these legacies? Uncover we'll speak to quite a few of these in our conversation today, but there's a 26% attainment gap between white students and black students in terms of outcomes. We know that lots of black students have a lack of sense of belonging in their institution, which is a real issue and concern. Racial harassment reporting structures are inadequate. We've got lower continuation rates for black students as well. The curriculum, a big focus of many of these campaigns, is Eurocentric and doesn't reflect the diversity of the student experience. We have very few black professors and even fewer black women professors. And that translates to few black senior leaders, and we know that then the progression, as part of that, the progression to postgraduate research is very poor for black students as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, and racial inequalities, as we know, still persist. Now, what is a vision for ending racial inequality? I put a question mark because I think it's an open-ended question. I think there's lots of people will have different views and different opinions on what that looks like. The important thing to say is I put a photo on the right of some smiling black students. The reality is it is more than just having some smiley faces on your prospectus or on your website. It's about real fundamental change in outcomes. So things like supporting Support services are culturally competent. The curriculum is reflective of the diverse student background. You have diverse academic and non-academic staff at all levels, right through the university. Instances of racism are dealt with very, very quickly, but they're rare. Black students crucially feel like they belong, and as part of that, the attainment gaps or any other disparities are eliminated as well. So that is part of where we're trying to head to, and I'm sure many people will have other things to add to that list. So where are we now? Well, as this conversation shows, debates about racism and colonialism are alive and well. We do have sector-wide initiatives which are in place. So you see there the Race Equality Charter Mark, and the Office of Students as well has regulated as part of the access and participation plans for institutions to report against closing a lot of these gaps. Sector leaders are taking the issue more seriously, undoubtedly, and that's a change that we've seen in the last couple of years. I mentioned the NUS Universities UK Black Attainment Gap report, and that was part of the sector, I think, really taking this issue more seriously. But I think there is a lack of what I would call a comprehensive institution-wide approach to tackling racial inequalities, and I'd be very keen to hear from you on Twitter, on the chat, if your institution has taken this approach. And I will go into what that looks like in the next couple of minutes. So, different institutional approaches. Now, I'm conscious there's a lot on the screen, so I'm not asking you to absorb all of this right now, but I thought I'd just give two illustrative examples of what this could look like. So on the left, we have County-Shire University, of course, a made-up university, and I'll briefly describe to you what they did, and then we'll move on to the other fictitious university, the University of Fibchester. So County-Shire University, what do they do? The university executive team launches a BAME inequality strategy 1 month after the Black Lives Matter. That strategy is the responsibility of the E&D team. Delivery is met within existing budgets. Attainment gap work remains with the PVC education. And in the first year, we get rollout of unconscious bias training, not mandatory, but encouraged. 3 new groups with Black representation to tackle racism: an attainment gap committee, student experience, and staff recruitment working group. All Black students are enrolled on a mentoring scheme as soon as they arrive to raise their aspirations, and Black staff and students are invited to listening sessions every month to give their views on how to tackle racism in the university. So senior leadership are clearly behind it, lots and lots of activity and lots of initiatives. Let's compare that with the University of Fibchester on the right. Well, what do they do? Well, the University of Fibchester take a slightly different approach. The executive team engages with external specialists and the Students' Union to conduct an institution-wide consultation of BME staff and students on race. That report disaggregates experiences of the BME category, provides very clear recommendations for outcomes and actions, and those actions are prioritized by the staff and students who were consulted. The executive team then recruits a PVC inclusion who reports to the VC, sits on the exec team, oversees the implementation and recommendations, and crucially brings together all the E&D work in the institution. And then the exec team launch a 200K anti-racism strategy that includes mandatory race equity training for all staff, race equity training incorporated into inductions, a culture change program, which is institution-wide to upskill all staff on inclusive practices in teaching and in the workplace, and then a racial harassment reporting unit is established to deal with all forms of racism experienced by staff and students. Now, I'm sure many of you have guessed which one I think is the better one. Crucially, though, even though the University of Fibchester is, in my view, the better approach, it isn't the right approach. There is no right approach. The actions and the outcomes and the solutions will all be institution specific, and that's very, very important. But I'll just briefly talk to you why I think that the one on the right is a better approach than the County-Shire University on the left. Just very quickly, County-Shire University, you can see that there is clearly buy-in from the senior team. They want to do something about it, but they launch it very, very quickly. And there might be concerns about the extent to which there was extensive consultation. You've got the alarm bells about the delivery met within existing budgets, and I'll talk about the importance of resourcing this stuff later. We've got a bit of division between where some of this work sits. So is it with the PVC education? Is it with the E&D team? There's clearly, in what I've sketched out, not really a site where this is being brought together, and that could create some confusion. We've then got the rollout of unconscious bias training, which is non-mandatory. I think unconscious bias training, in my view, my personal view, is outdated, and you need a bit more of a comprehensive equity training program, which is far more on the education side rather than sort of the online unconscious bias training that you get. And the fact that it's non-mandatory means that people who are interested, so for example, people on this call will be going, but what about those people who perhaps need it more and who aren't necessarily interested? Real concerns about the proliferation of committees with black representation. If it's typical of any institution in the UK, the number of black staff will be few and far between. So forcing them to spread themselves thinly on lots and lots of different committees is a real concern, and we've seen it happen in lots of institutions. We've got this idea that all black students should be enrolled in a mentoring scheme immediately. That seems like a solution has been found before drilling into whether that's the issue. Lots of black students have very high aspirations, but there are structural challenges and barriers there. And then we've got this idea of listening sessions. Again, something that feels good, but is it useful? Is it what's being asked for? There are questions there. Moving on to FibChester, what are the positives here? Well, clearly there's been an extensive consultative process, and it should be a process that has the trust of the communities who are affected. We've got that important aspect on that second point there on disaggregating BME and understanding that it isn't the case that all people in that category have the same experiences, and it's important to make sure the recommendations are prioritized and affect that. We've then got the recruitment of a senior leader who is to spearhead this work, reporting directly to the VC. That's something which we've seen very effective in lots of different institutions and really does bring together all that really important work. And then we've got the launching of a new strategy with significant resource, and 200k, I'm sure if there are any senior leaders on the call, will probably bulk at that figure. But the reality is institutions spend that amount of money and a lot more when doing institution-wide big transformation projects, and this needs to be seen as part of that. So I'm not saying that's the figure, but getting into a space where we're thinking, okay, how are we actually going to resource this, I think is very important. We've got the mandatory race equity training, so not just unconscious bias training, but as an institution, FibChest have said, well, we want to take this seriously, we want to see this as core, as our training for all staff. So as other things are mandatory, we put race equity training as part of that. It's incorporated into induction as well, which is also very important, so that all students coming in have a chance to explore these issues as well. And then that's part of an institution-wide culture change program, and that's to upskill all staff in inclusive practices. You notice on the left that decolonizing the curriculum is there, but is it core? Is it part of a wider program, so that you don't have to sort of be teaching this stuff in a piecemeal way? It's actually part of the way in which we do things at the university. And then that final point about a racial harassment reporting unit established, again, showing that centrality of the coordinated approach there. So as I said, the University of FibChester is by no means the correct answer, but I think it speaks to an approach which is a bit more centrally coordinated, has the resource behind it, and will be more effective in the long run. So just to kind of recap on that, what are the key principles when tackling racial inequalities in higher education? You've got to take an institution-wide coordinated approach. That means senior leaders need to be coordinating that centrally. You've got to center Black students and staff experiences when implementing solutions, but when doing so, they shouldn't be the ones who are carrying out the solutions or implementing it themselves without the support. As part of that, then source appropriate expertise. I hear a lot of very well-meaning individuals and institutions kind of twiddling their thumbs saying, we don't really know what to do, we don't know what to do. If it's in any other instance where you don't know what to do, you go and source that expertise, and we need to start seeing that as that. Far too often, lots of these issues are treated as a sort of political issue that sort of needs to be managed politically, as opposed to a capability issue or a lack of capability issue. So if you don't have those capabilities, you need to go out to recruitment, you need to find the people that do, and then crucially, when those people are in place, you then need to resource that. And if that involves a big culture change program, that needs to be part of that process already. A quick point on that resourcing point, actually. As I said, this isn't an add-on, this needs to be a core of what the university does. And I think crucially, if you do this properly, you will find that a lot of the processes, a lot of the procedures, a lot of the systems that you're having to change to ensure that Black students and that Black staff are not being discriminated against, you will find lots of issues that need to be solved, which will benefit all staff and all students as well. So this isn't something that is some sort of special case just for Black students and Black staff. If you consult Black students and they say, yeah, actually a massive problem is the timetabling, and that's really negatively affecting our student experience, well, that's something that I'm sure lots of students, all students will be affected by, but probably not as acutely. You fix that problem, you fixed it for the wider student population as well. So in terms of making the argument for that resource, you've got to take it in a holistic way. And then just sort of some very brief sector-wide recommendations which we can unpack on, just to get people thinking. I've asked our speakers today to really get ourselves into the solutions focused area. I think there are some things missing from the sector which we could benefit from. So I think we could do with a BME graduate scheme for progression into university professional services. You know, we like to focus a lot on the education side. Sometimes we miss the importance of diversifying university professional services who are critical to the running of our universities and make decisions every minute that will affect students and all students. So it's really important that those are diverse. On the academic side, we do need a sector-wide graduate scheme campaign for progression into PGR, and that includes contextual offers. If we acknowledge that there's an attainment gap, what are we doing to acknowledge the fact that those students may not have the grades that typically may lend themselves to a PGR route? So, and I know that there are organizations out there which are focused on this area. I think that needs a bit more resourcing. I'd like to see some accredited HE race equity CPD programs tailored to university role. If they are there, please do tweet me, please do let me know. Let's share these resources. But I think, you know, if I'm working in the finance division, what does race equity look like? Can I do a course? That way it makes it much easier for universities, if they want to identify those individuals who are taking this seriously, to make sure those individuals are identified by having these CPD programs, as you would with any other capabilities as well. And then the final point, I think, is the next frontier. I think there's a lot of conversation about this within the sector. We need to engage the professional, statutory and regulatory bodies as well, because they often have a big say on what's in the curriculum and the way in which higher education is provided. And that also includes those organizations that take students on for placements and obviously employers as well. So how do we make sure that the entire HE ecosystem and the wider players as well are also included in the conversation? So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour through some of my thoughts on why I think an institution-wide approach is necessary for higher education. I won't take questions right now. I think we will move swiftly on to our first panel discussion today. Debbie, is there anything I need?
Just want two very quick clarifications at this point. One is that are you willing to make your slides available, because everyone's desperate to know, will they get them afterwards? Is that
yes,
okay?
I'm happy.
So everyone can be assured that's going to happen. And the other thing I think is probably worth addressing at this point is the kind of, people are questioning, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Black? Are we talking about BAME? What are the categories we're dealing with here? And I think that's kind of worth articulating at this point, how you're thinking about that.
Sure, and that's a very, very good prompt, something I should have addressed right at the beginning. Look, the BAME category is quite controversial at times, because we know it doesn't capture the nuances of the different experiences. I think it is useful in one sense, because there are clear disparities there. So we can look at that category of BAME and all the individuals who are within that, and or BME, and see that there are disparities there. I think if the movement at the moment has demonstrated one thing, is that Black students, Black individuals on the whole, are at the bottom of the pile. They are the most acutely affected by these issues, and it's important to, I think, focus on those experiences, and more acutely at this time, but also in general. Racial inequalities exist within society. We should be seeking to tackle all of them, but disaggregating those experiences is absolutely vital as well. And that means, in this context, you are consulting those different communities, finding those distinct concerns, and making sure that when you're taking action, that is front of mind. So by no means lump BME and BAME all together, but understand that Asian students will face discrimination, students from other backgrounds, non-white backgrounds will face discriminations as well. What are we doing for all those groups, but not missing, of course, Black students, Black staff who are often at the sharp end of that. Brilliant, thank you. So I will move us on to our first panel today. I'm really excited to have some fantastic speakers lined up for you today. Firstly, we're going to talk briefly about studying and working in academic communities and confronting bias and prejudice, thinking about those cultures, talking about those microaggressions and biases, and how to recognize them if perhaps you're not from those communities. And explore some of those areas where bias may be lurking. And joining me is Dr. Jason Ade, who is the Assistant Professor in Sociology at Durham University in the Department of Sociology. He is a visiting research fellow at the Ohio State University in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, a research associate at Nelson Mandela University in the Centre for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation, and a trustee of the Runnymede Trust, the UK's leading race equality think tank. Jason is also a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and a trustee of the British Sociological Association, and sits on the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, the National Advisory Panel for that, and is a school governor at Shaftesbury Park Primary School in London. Jason, thank you for joining us. And also Paulette Williams, who's the head of Student Success Projects and co-lead for the BAME awarding projects at the University College London, UCL, which is a 3-year project which aims to eliminate the BAME attainment gap. And Paulette has worked at UCL since 2005, primarily in widening participation and access, and is also involved in a lot of work in terms of progression to postgraduate study as well, which I'm sure she can talk about later. So Jason, Paulette, thank you so much for joining us. Jason, perhaps if we start with you, just very quickly, in terms of how this will work with these sessions, speakers will speak for about 5 minutes, and then I'll kick off with a few questions, and then we'll open it to the floor. I think Debbie will help us coordinate some of these questions that are coming through. So Jason, if we start with you.
Hi, firstly, I want to say thank you so much for having me here. Really, really appreciated. And thank you, Debbie, for the hard work that's gone behind the scenes. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're keeping well. It's really, I guess, interesting time, for want of a better term. It's always a privilege to share any platform with the fantastic Paulette Williams. So I think one of the most important things is, as kind of Amate has already alluded to, we've reached a really seminal moment in kind of race equality history almost. And I think that is quite an interesting juncture for us to really kind of reevaluate the instruments we're using, think about some of the complacency that's set in across the sector, and maybe think about what the sector actually represents. So if we kind of begin with this idea of university being a microcosm of society, and this kind of canon of all things egalitarian, inclusive. I think interestingly, as one of society's major institutions, a lot of that is actually quite contradictory. So universities in many ways are actually worse than some other institutions in terms of race equality and having penetrative interventions that really tackle and address all of racism in its kind of systemic, cultural and insidious forms. And I suppose one of the things that's kind of really important is thinking about the cultures that enable this prejudice. And I think one of the things that becomes interesting is how complicit we can all be in those cultures. So for example, when we kind of think about the progression of BAME staff, particularly professional staff and academic staff, what we see continuously are BAME staff being overlooked for promotion, being overlooked for opportunities to progress, being overlooked in terms of pay differentials. And what becomes interesting is that as colleagues, when I talk about that complicity, are these things that we're aware of? How much of a blind eye do we turn to these situations? And I suppose when we kind of think about what we're kind of, I guess, reconceptualizing in light of what's happened over the last month or so, what allyship looks like, that giving up of privilege, actually a huge part of acknowledging it is actually recognizing that there are differentials in the first place, which don't reside in the idea of meritocracy. So I think there's this idea that, I've earned the position I've got to. There's never a disqualification of that, but so have BAME individuals, and they are not remunerated fiscally or reputationally in the same ways. I think in terms of the patterns of prejudice, I think one of the things that's really interesting is thinking about the subtleness of racism within higher education institutions and society more generally. And I think, interestingly, what we are now seeing is, I think if racism was a race, I think there's always this idea that we can keep abreast of it or keep ahead of it. And I think that's quite difficult because it's starting from a pretty strong position in the first place. And one of the things that I would kind of urge us to really think about is really one of the cultures that I guess sustain this prejudice, but more importantly, the patterns. So the contours of racism are actually quite hard to track, but how we can stay abreast of it, as Amitai's kind of alluded to earlier, is really this collective action. I think the collective action becomes really, really important. So interestingly, we have always kind of left people of colour, BAME, black, whichever inference you prefer to use, to deal with issues of racism, even though in many cases they don't have the power or the privilege to absolve themselves from that situation, or in many cases I've never met a person of colour that asked to be in a racist situation. So the actual construct of racism is, has kind of its roots and its tentacles really stem from white supremacy and ideas around white privilege. So I do think it's important that we think about how we culturally address and dismantle those aspects, because I guess some of the mechanisms that we've been using haven't worked, and I would suggest they may have not worked because there has been an onus on black people to figure out issues around racism. And really, again, the emphasis really is on that collective action and white people really kind of stepping up to the plate and thinking about how they can reconceptualize and redefine their allyship with this notion of racism continuously reinventing itself. I think that's really, really important, particularly in spaces of leadership, in spaces of privilege, in spaces of decision-making. That kind of stakeholder allyship becomes really, really important and integral to what we're looking to do in terms of having an inclusive academy that is reflective of the multicultural society that we live in. Lastly, just kind of want to talk about microaggressions and the biases that kind of encompass this when you're not the target. So I think one of the interesting things is, from a personal perspective, I've always been in situations where when people kind of get a semblance that there's something that's happened that's slightly untoward, one of the interesting things is really this idea of, Jason, I think something happened there, but I don't, are you all right? Are you okay? And I always kind of felt inside, I prefer, I know what happened, but I prefer that allyship is actually converted into challenging the person who may have inflicted that particular laceration at the time. And it is that interesting thing with microaggressions, it's cumulative, it's death by 1,000 cuts. In terms of hemorrhaging, in terms of kind of, I guess, stopping that hemorrhaging or bleeding, almost that emotional bleeding, what we do need to see is people not being complicit in that by challenging it. Very often, BAME academics and professional staff are in vulnerable positions, and the challenging of that is consequential on already damaged pipelines in terms of career progression and actually engagement within the wider university. So I do think it's kind of really important that when we kind of see those acts of microaggressions, which are subtle acts of racism, they're not overt acts of racism. And interestingly, I think we all gravitate towards those overt acts of racism, but it's actually the subtle acts that are more penetrative and more dangerous over a period of time for the BAME member of staff. And I'll just conclude by saying, in terms of the particular areas of unexamined bias, I think one of the things that becomes really pertinent is really thinking about the privilege that we all hold. So I always try and work from a positionality perspective, and I recognise that as a black male, I occupy a very privileged position, particularly over black women and women of colour. And I recognise that the unexamined bias in this kind of work is really the labour that happens in terms of race equality work. And I think it'd be remiss of me not to say that that labour has been taken up by predominantly black women and South Asian women in the academy. And again, often unremunerated, fiscally and reputationally. And I do think that, if anything else, this is a call for all of us to engage in that collective endeavour, which challenges unexamined biases, why we lean to BAME women to kind of resolve us or take us out of this problem, and really think about how we can make this a more collective endeavour. And again, just thank you so much to everyone that's tuned in today. It really, really means a lot, and I feel very fortunate to again be sharing this platform with the fantastic Paulette Williams and Amate. Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much. There's a lot you've covered there, and a lot I'm sure we'll unpack in the next bit. But first, Paulette, it'd be good to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amate, and also it's great to be here with Jason as well. So I wanted to kind of start off by saying that, and you've already touched on this, the title of this event was Black Lives Matter. The description spoke a lot about BAME, and I agree with you, Amate. Sometimes, you know, that label can be used, it can be effective, but it can also be abused and become extremely ineffective. And I just kind of wanted to touch on the fact that we've seen it being used definitely within institutions in my role at UCL, where, you know, it helps to get buy-in for certain things, it helps to secure resources. We've seen it being ineffective because, you know, even within that, if you're trying to address the issues faced by Black students who report via your NSS that they're the least satisfied in your institutions, you're not going to address that in the same way that you would for possibly, you know, a project we've got at UCL, Muslim women who are going out on placements as part of their course. It's two completely different things. So when you bunch them all together, it causes problems, and it also causes problems in terms of data and the way that we analyze data. So we've seen some headlines maybe where it's been abused in terms of recruitment numbers, when institutions talk about the number of BAME students that they've recruited, always kind of trying to overshadow the fact that the numbers of recruitment, the recruitment numbers for Black students are still extremely low, particularly at sort of Russell Group and elite institutions. So I just wanted to make that point to sort of start off with. So I was asked just to kind of talk about my position in terms of these issues. It wasn't mentioned, Amate didn't mention it, but I'm also founder of an organisation called Leading Roots. And we support Black students from sort of prospective students in going into undergraduate, all the way through to those that are kind of thinking about doing a PhD. And we've already heard about the challenges that they face along that sort of pipeline from the start when they're just thinking about it to becoming academics. So for me, you know, I thought about this moment. We keep talking about this moment in terms of Black Lives Matter. And it kind of dawned on me that this moment is different to everyone, right? So it means something different to Black people, to white people, and to higher education more generally. I think for Black people, and I can only really speak for myself and maybe some of the people in my circle that I speak to, you know, my Blackness plays out in every aspect of my life, right? From, you know, entertainment, food, motherhood, whatever. And I love that, you know, my Blackness is not a disadvantage for me. The issue comes when, you know, I encounter racism, which threatens basically to overshadow so much joy in my life. And that is reflected as well in the workplace, in higher education through the education system. So I know maybe it's being framed at the moment as like a negative thing, but it's not for me, right? I'm kind of, I think it's important to kind of emphasize that this isn't all negative and the issue is racism. So I think for a lot of white people, and of course there are many white people who have been doing this work, who in this moment are trying to sort of leverage opportunities for Black people and Black-led initiatives. I'm fortunate enough to encounter many of them through Leading Roots work, through UCL work. But, you know, and many of them are sort of kind of acknowledging that a lot of Black people, as Jason touched on, are leading this work and we're tired. And they're removing some of that labor for us, which is amazing. But for many white people, I think this moment comes with a lot of enthusiasm and a desire to sort of learn more. And a lot of Black people that I've spoken to, we're not really sure, we don't understand why now. I'd love to hear in the comments, maybe from some people who can just tell me why now, what has kind of made you so much more open and willing to hear us. I think it's an amazing thing. But if we don't kind of understand why that is, we don't really understand, or we can't really predict how long it will last, right? So a lot of us are confused, we're a bit skeptical, and again, we're a bit tired, but this moment is not about charity work, right? What I hope is gained from it is that individuals and institutions take forward any learning from this time in our day-to-day interactions with our students, with our staff, and just every day, right? So I think it's important to make sure that whatever it is that you're learning, or the way that you're learning, or trying to channel this enthusiasm, is done with a bit of depth, you know? So maybe you've read a book, or you've gone to a protest. I see loads of kind of resources in the chat, which are great. There's a process between that and then, you know, heading up initiatives in an institution, or you know, kind of people that have got in contact with me, which is amazing, that want to start work. But there's a bit in the middle if you haven't done that, which requires you to digest how you fit within this, right? And how you've played a part, how we've all played a part in what's happening. So I think this moment for higher education is about transparency, it's about authenticity, and it's about honesty, right? So I think HEIs should have fairly low expectations in terms of the expected response from Black people and people of colour more generally. If you have students within your institution and staff within your institution, which you probably have, who have experienced racial harassment, if, as Amate touched on, your institution is kind of, the history is rooted in racism, and if, you know, those incidents of racism haven't been addressed, where often the system has failed Black people in terms of, you know, when we're trying to report incidents that have happened, there are people within your institution who are really seen as somewhat untouchable, because of the power that they have within your institution, whether that's to do with status, or whether that's to do with, you know, the amount of funding that they're bringing in. When you tweet Black Lives Matter and you release this statement, despite all the amazing work that is going on, and I've witnessed that from many of my colleagues at UCL, people will not believe you. And unfortunately, they've been let down by you, and it will take time to build up that trust. So, you know, I would hope that institutions keep plugging away, keep putting the resources into that work, and, you know, show the stamina and resilience that we've had to for many generations, until one day that balance shifts, and, you know, you've done enough to kind of show the results and make a change within the sector. So this work is definitely ongoing. And I would say, I think, Amate, you also had a kind of article on this. I used to kind of say, oh, it's going to take a long time. I still believe it will take a long time, but I think part of that is in terms of like the investment of time. So it's not like a surface thing that Amate showed with the 2 separate universities, an investment of time, quality time. But, you know, COVID-19 has showed us how quickly we can move on things, you know, all those sort of barriers in terms of committees and structures and all these things that we have to do in order to get things moving. I don't know who made those up, because clearly when something is urgent, it can be addressed quickly. And I think there needs to be more urgency placed on this issue, right? So for me, I hope this moment is a time for change in terms of our perspective, but also in terms of the way that we address issues that are facing so many people within institutions and affecting it's not just our day-to-day life at work, but then that carries on into our lives in general, and can have a really, really bad effect. So I'll leave it there. Just looking forward to the discussion with you guys.
Thanks, Paula, and you've raised some really important issues as well. Following Jason, I think that point about the trust, regaining the trust beyond statements, I think is really important. And I can imagine that university comms teams are very keen to get out Black Lives Matter statements. It's the first time I've really seen universities as a whole kind of talk about some of these issues in this sort of way at a moment like this. But I can imagine you would ask somebody in the university comms team what the reaction was like in the comments or being quote tweeted, and I saw lots of examples of students talking really genuinely about their experiences and the challenges that they'd had whilst they're there or years and years ago, and that really should highlight the importance of, it's not about just statements, it's about real structural change. Just both of you really quickly, just to kick off, we've got about 15 minutes for some questions, and I'll ask Debbie to see what's come through. I suppose I'd keen to know, you both touched on the importance of white colleagues either intervening in certain situations or actually taking the initiative and doing some of the work and some of the labor in this space. Do you have any examples of where you've seen that being done effectively? And I suppose if not, what sorts of things would you kind of be looking for your white colleagues to sort of really be doing in this space? Perhaps we start with Jason.
Okay, I was going to say, I suppose, and I myself am an idealist, so I always try and look for the best in everyone where possible. And I guess where I have seen some fantastic examples of, I guess, white allyship, if this is what we're talking about, then it has been in terms of people disrupting privileged spaces, and in particular, really looking for ways to challenge differentials in particular instances. So I'm very fortunate to work with Professor Vicky Bolivar, who's a professor of sociology at Durham University. And over the last 6 years, a lot of her work has really been around challenging whiteness and its tentacles in terms of what it infiltrates and how it infiltrates it. And a lot of her work's really been focused around thinking about BAME differentials, particularly in terms of UCAS, and getting into particular types of universities, and really promoting an agenda at Durham to really challenge and look at the staff population and how we can diversify that staff population. And she's also kind of actively engaged in looking to support BAME PGR students in terms of making transitions into higher education. And I cite Vicky is a fantastic example because of the work she's done over a sustained period. So without being cynical, she was engaging this before it's kind of become fashionable. She's been, as long as I've known her, which is nearly 6 years, she's been doing this work. And another colleague that I'd like to point to is Dr. Dina Zoe Belluigi at Queen's University Belfast, who has also been a fantastic white ally and really tries to kind of shine a light on, I guess, global inequality within the academy, but in particular, how white people kind of take spaces and are gatekeepers to knowledge and kind of residents of space without making that space inclusive. And she is engaged in a lot of challenging work to really dismantle those spaces and to open up more spaces for BAME professional staff and academics.
Thank you. And Paulette, any examples?
I think the best example is probably the support that I've had from colleagues specifically in the Access and Widening Participation team at UCL, who supported Leading Roots from the very start, from the very sort of, from me just having an idea. I think the position that I envisioned for Leading Roots is more of a community-led, Black-led approach to addressing some of the issues faced by Black students in higher education. And, I think we're able to do things that an institution can't do. And having colleagues that kind of understand that and are not only willing to support that verbally or, by attending events, but to help in terms of funding, I think has been extremely important. So I think there are gatekeepers, and if you're a gatekeeper and you have that power and privilege to make decisions, I think making those decisions in a way that you trust people and you're willing to take risks on people and you're willing to do things that other institutions are not doing, I think can pay off for you in the end. We've helped so many young people through Leading Roots and so many students through Leading Roots. We've given a platform to so many Black academics, and that wouldn't have been possible without some of the allies that we work with at UCL, but also other organisations that we work with through sort of Wellcome Trust, SAGE, people who have power that are able to kind of, I guess, redistribute it in a way, and trust Black people and people of colour that we know what is best for our community in that sense.
I think that's really important. And I mean, in a practical sense, there just aren't enough Black people in higher education at the moment to do this work on such a huge scale. So that, you know, it's not going to be done that way, and it's, the onus shouldn't always be on us. I'm struck by the number of people as well, students and academics, who go into higher education to do their particular area of expertise and then find themselves being advocates of, yeah, that was never.
Students. I'm like, our students do not sign up to a course to be an activist.
Yeah.
Somehow, you know, and you know, I say it like that, but then also thinking about the impact that then has on their mental health and their studies, like what they begin to prioritize within that space, because they can't let it go. I understand that urge to kind of challenge things, especially if that's your personality type. But then equally, you know, they pay fees and they don't pay fees to be activists. They're amazing young people, but yeah, it's not right to me.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Debbie, have we had anything through in terms of questions? I know you've been monitoring.
Yeah, we've got quite a sort of broad diversity of questions here, and I think, and there is quite a lot of sort of, I guess, concern and anxiety about what the kind of balance is in collective action between, I guess, working closely with Black students and staff, their lived experience, and the role of white people as allies and particularly as leaders. And you know, I suppose if you feel there's more to say on that might be something to pick up. So we were saying, getting, you know, the difference between getting Black students involved and versus kind of expecting them to do all the work, and actually, and also a request for of an example of someone making an intervention, a positive intervention in a kind of decision-making space or a leadership space that challenged a kind of a moment of microaggression or prejudice.
Jason, maybe you mentioned in what you're talking about in terms of on that latter point about, you know, somebody afterwards coming up to you and saying, "Oh, are you okay? What happened there? You know, is everything okay?" And kind of hoping that an intervention has kind of been made beforehand. I'm also struck. But also balancing that against the sort of point you made about this stuff is cumulative, and sometimes that even as Black staff or Black students, you don't really, it's sometimes very difficult to pinpoint specific microaggressions, but you realize over time that's where you've been at. But have you ever seen, or if not seen, what would you like to see in terms of Black staff intervening in those spaces? White staff intervening in those.
I guess for me, it's always been one of those things that's been, you know, it's not so much the public humiliation. I think it's the residual effect. So often when, you know, one goes to lay their head down at night and they think about what they reflect upon a day, and they think about what they've encountered. And for me, I've always been struck by, you know, my general disposition has always been to, if I saw my brother or sister or anything in between struggling, I would try and intervene, and I would try and do that. And I often joke about it, but it's definitely cost me 3 jobs. So I've done it, and I do continue to do it. And sometimes what I just find interesting is the observation of what's happened afterwards. And I suppose, as I said, to kind of reiterate, what I would like, particularly when we're talking about, you know, advocating on behalf of staff and students as well, because I think it's important to include students in this. There are times where students have made a complaint, students have made a complaint about a white member of staff that may have said something inappropriate or has acted inappropriately with regards to being racially discriminatory. And often it's been brushed off. And then you have other members of staff who say, "I've heard that member of staff say that before, but actually, you know, I don't want to rock the boat." And that kind of raising that head above the parapet, you know, I personally would like to see white colleagues, you know, look to disrupt those spaces more, you know, be because I think as a BAME person, when you're in that space and you challenge that, you are kind of categorized as aggressive, angry, sometimes inarticulate, lacking restraint. Where I think when white people occupy those spaces, they're seen as forthright, confident, assertive. And it's kind of thinking about, one, how we reconceptualize and redefine the language, the physical language of that space, the physical literacy even of that space. And two, just think about really, when white people observe those things, the complicity in that act of microaggression is to actually be silent. It's to not challenge it, it's to not say anything. And I think it's kind of, without being harsh, quite useless afterwards to point out to the individual who's encountered that particular form of, systemic violence. I understand what you're going through. I'm so sorry you went through it. That kind of, horse after the bolt has bolted type kind of discourse is kind of, it doesn't really help. And it definitely doesn't help staff, and it definitely doesn't help students. And I've seen students encounter pain over a sustained period where there are clear power hierarchical differentials, and students aren't able to engage in spaces where they can really verbalize what they've experienced and have those experiences taken seriously, reported, and kind of cascaded upwards in terms of being dealt with. I do think white people need to be perhaps more present and vigilant of what's happening around them and really interrogate those spaces, because, to encounter the violent act in the first place and then to challenge it, what you actually end up encountering is a double violence, because invariably BAME individuals are always punished, whether it's verbally, reputationally, or fiscally, for challenging those inequitable or discriminatory environments.
I think you mentioned some really interesting things, and I've got some relatives as well who are in the NHS who talk to exactly the same issues. So this is not an issue unique to higher education. This is playing out consistently across lots of organisations. And Paula, any reflections on that? I think I was sort of, struck by the amount of work that needs to go in to make sure that people understand and are educated on these issues, because for many white practitioners in higher education, they don't have to encounter these things on a daily basis. So when these things happen, or it's new, it's novel, and if they haven't had any conversations prior to that, any education prior to that, in terms of understanding what the situation looks like, and as an active bystander, what can I actually do, then you just end up with, as Jason was saying, a kind of either not noticing or then going up to you afterwards and saying, "Oh, I hope you're okay," when actually you could have done with some support in that moment. Any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, sometimes I'm a bit torn. I think for me, maybe less so on the sort of situation, the experiences of individuals, and more so on the experiences as an institution, like running an institutional project. And sometimes I'm torn between this idea of, like, as an institutional project, we have to change hearts and minds, and we have to make sure that everyone understands, everyone's, got the knowledge and fully aware of the experiences of all the students. And sometimes I just feel like we just need to have more accountability in place, right? We just need more processes in place that make sure that people don't get away with racist behavior. And I think there are some people that don't understand. But I think people will understand a lot quicker if there's some accountability or repercussions to racist behavior or, discriminatory behavior. And I also think the more dangerous people are those people that do understand and know that they can get away with it. So I think I am torn, and I think there is a place for training and professional development and all that sort of thing. But I also feel like sometimes within institutional projects, we hide a lot behind data, we hide a lot behind all the excuses that people make. And we just need processes in place that make people have to answer to, why do you have an awarding gap and what are you trying to do about it? These are sort of direct questions that I think we need to kind of have answered.
Thank you, Paula. And I think that's a good place for us to end. Obviously, this conversation will continue, so please do online engage in the conversation, contact our panelists, and keep talking about these issues in your institutions. I'd just like to say thank you to Jason and Paulette for this part of today's conversation. It's obviously always a delight to speak to both of you and to hear your views as well. And yeah, we found the conversation very, very engaging. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to take a 15-minute break for you to grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Please don't go anywhere. We'll be back at 15:15, so that's 11:15, where we'll have another panel with two fantastic speakers, and then our final session will be at 12. So please do come back and join us at 15. Thank you.
Can I also just add, the epic music is about to start again, so those of you who are enjoying it will be glad to hear. And if you are streaming us through Facebook, we have now managed to expand the Zoom capacity. If you wish to try and join us again on Zoom for 11:15, you will be very welcome. And thank you again for your patience while we resolve the issue.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, it's 11:15, which means we are back and ready to kick off for our next couple of sessions, our next 2 sessions. So the first one will be on intersections and capturing and acting on the lived.
I can't hear you.
Oh, Marilyn, can you not hear me at all?
I can't hear you, Amity.
Hilary, can you hear me?
Can you hear?
Yeah, I can.
So I can hear you.
Oh.
Just let's see whether Marilyn, can you hear me now?
Okay, shall I just suggest that we start with Hilary and we'll communicate offline with Marilyn to just try and sort out the issue.
Brilliant, thank you.
I don't know what's happened. I'm not hearing you. Are you hearing me? I'm not hearing you. I'm not sure what to do.
Let's see. Okay, well, what I'll do is I will kick things off. I'll introduce the 2 speakers, and then I think Wonkhe should be able to get in touch with Marilyn. But let me see whether I can contact Marilyn quickly. Obviously, we're all getting used to adapting to this new way.
I can't hear you, Amity.
I feel like I need a piece of paper to hold up to say.
Do you want to go first, Hilary? I'll log off and come back on.
Yeah, we'll do that. That sounds like a good plan. The number of times, I've never done a sort of Zoom call before March, and then on hundreds and hundreds of these, but we're all getting used to it. But I would say, actually, I can see that we've got about 900 people joining, and this is a really good and effective way to get in touch with lots of people and have a conversation like this. And Twitter is very much alive, so please do keep tweeting, please do keep the conversation there. So this section is on intersections, capturing and acting on lived experience. We have 2 speakers, Marilyn, of course, and Hilary, who you can see. And in this section, we want to talk a bit about the characteristics that shape the lived experience, the limitations of BAME as a category, and the sustainability of some of these projects to enhance the experience. Marilyn, can you hear us? No, I don't think she can, so we'll hold on there. But I think speaking first will be Hilary Abebio, who is the incoming VPHE at the NUS, National Union of Students. She's got one of the best jobs in higher education, has just finished her term as the undergraduate education officer at Bristol SU. And during her time in that role, she did a lot of work focused on decolonising the curriculum, creating links with employability, personal development, and alumni for Black and BAME students, and pushing for a proactive and transparent approach to tackling racism. She has a degree in social policy, and while a student was chair of the SU's Widening Participation Network and a committee member of the African and Caribbean Society, and just a few days into her role at NUS, I'm sure it's going to have a fantastic term. Marilyn, can you hear me? No, I thought I heard myself echo, but I'll introduce Marilyn. Professor Marilyn Holness is the Professor of Education and Engagement and Practice and Director of the Student Engagement, Director of Student Engagement at the University of Roehampton. She's the Deputy Chair of Tackling Racism Task Force for London Higher, leading a stream of work on the awarding gap. Her scholarship is on enhancing teaching quality and social justice. She has extensive experience across secondary schools and HE teaching, initial teacher education, student engagement consultancy, and senior leadership. And she has a voice on several education governing and advisory boards, and her achievements have been recognised and awarded an OBE for services to teacher education. So we'll wait for Marilyn to get back online with us, but we'll start off with Hilary. Hilary will speak for a couple of minutes. Hopefully Marilyn will be back by then, and then we'll take some questions. Okay, Hilary, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm actually day 3 into being VPHE, so I'm still very new, and if I make a mistake, don't hold me to it. So I thought when I was preparing this introduction, it would be good for me to sort of characterize what lived experiences are and what they look like before talking about what it really means to listen to and engage.
Can't work out.
Lived experiences within HE. And I think firstly, the first point I want to drill home is that lived experiences aren't monolithic in nature. They are very diverse and complex. And it's important that we recognize this when we are looking and hearing and listening to Black people with lived experiences of racism. I think in understanding the plurality and the diversity, I'm using lots of big words because I'm trying to sound fancy for my first time speaking, so forgive me if nothing makes sense. But really understanding the plurality and diversity of Black people, we really need to, as a sector, step up and stop trying to get Black people to speak to us if we're not prepared to give them the space and the platform to have their experiences valued and really explored in a way that can talk about the intersections with their experience. And so I can give an example. As myself, I'm a Black woman, and very often you'll find in the sector that you're either talking about race or you're talking about gender, and never really together. And I think it's important that we find ways of bringing in those intersectional conversations, especially with much more minoritized identities. And I'm thinking especially about Black trans people, for example, who get very, very little space in this conversation and need it. I think in doing this, we need to become more open as a sector and really, and I know you've heard all of this before, but prepare ourselves to be uncomfortable. And I think the key thing in doing this is making sure that we are open to unlearning some things and also learning some things that we didn't expect to learn. So not looking to sort of tick off what you read in a book, but really being open to hearing new things. And now going into speaking about why we need to like really be conscious about who we're speaking to. We need to be careful not to box Black students into sort of comfortable definitions that are good for our tracking of metrics. If you saw my campaign, I talked a lot about this. Sadly, in a music video that should never be found. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we really make sure we humanize the way we talk to and engage with Black students and Black staff members in this conversation. And to quickly touch on BAME, I'm sure Marilyn is going to talk more about it. There's 3 reasons why I think we need to think really, really hard about, you know, not using it as much as we do right now. I think first of all, it homogenizes the experiences of Black people, Asian people, and ethnic minorities in a way that it centers it on not being white, which inherently centers whiteness as the norm, and takes away from the fact that, you know, Black experiences aren't just in relation to whiteness, they're experiences in and of themselves, and we need to recognize that. I think secondly, we need to make sure that we don't use BAME because it breeds misunderstanding in our sector and in our society. I think we need to recognize that racism isn't a homogenous experience. Nobody experiences racism the same way. And I think really understanding that, you know, racism towards Black people, anti-Black racism, and racism towards Asian people, for example, or other minority ethnic groups are very different in many ways, even though there are shared experiences. And we need to really be acknowledging that, especially in looking at how we are moving forward in tackling racism. And finally, to keep this last bit of this bit short, it doesn't relate to anybody. I don't go around calling myself BAME, and I'm Ghanaian. Like, there's not a word in Ghana that's called BAME. So like, it's probably not the best word to use if you really want to make this conversation accessible. I think secondly, I'm now going to talking about how you're engaging these students and giving them the spaces to talk. I think right now, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, that we need to do things differently and be innovative with how we do it. I think what's been really, really inspiring for me is that I've come from a background working and studying at that has seen a lot of initiatives put forward to make sure that, you know, these conversations are much more accessible. And I think what has been key here is making sure that in inviting these conversations, we are empowering Black students to make these spaces their own and make it safe spaces for themselves in a way that isn't sort of boxed in by what institutions think are safe spaces. And this can really foster a sense of trust, shared experience, community, and validation amongst the Black community, to be free in opening up and sharing their experiences. I have to blow Bristol's horn a little bit here, because as I was starting my role at Bristol, we had introduced a scheme called Black Men / Black Women Talk. And it was essentially a scheme and a program that was set up by a student to enable Black students to come together and speak with one another and share their experiences in a safe space for each other. Which brings me on to my point, sorry, my voice cracked, brings me on to my point, talking about how are we going to engage students? We need to engage students by treating them as partners and not as test subjects. And given that Black people have been gaslighted for centuries and still are today, I think it's important that we give them back the power in enabling them to create communities that give them the confidence and validation to allow their voices to be heard. And of course, you all know that this should be underpinned with the correct support for trauma and support in getting through the impacts that racism has had on them. My last few bits. So in talking about approaches to solutions, my headline is, and forgive me for being blunt, it should never be expected for Black people to come up with the solutions to their own oppression. It doesn't make sense to be expected to solve problems that you did not create for yourself. And I think it's important that real responsibility is taken in doing this beyond just sort of making excuses or sort of excusing yourself by feeling like, I guess there's a safe space now that has been made for people that are uncomfortable with talking about race, where they don't want to put the responsibility on Black people. And yet when Black people are involved, the responsibility for whether a program or a scheme passes or fails feels like it's burdened on them. And I think it's important that we remove that from them, especially for the mental and emotional impact that it has on them. Secondly, when we listen to Black people, I said this before, but please don't listen to Black people just to tick off some ideas that you've already made in your rooms without them, and then just sort of like hear for them to like say the key word that you want to hear and then sort of tick off your solution. That's not how you do it. I think it's really important that we listen and hear what Black students and staff are actually saying they need and not just what you want to do. I think finally, we need to decolonize our approaches. This goes back to my point about it being centered on whiteness. I think it's important that we don't only push to tackle racism to try and make Black people equal or on par with white people. I think it's important that we sort of wipe the slate clean and allow and empower and lift Black students and staff to be able to create their own measures of success and their own measures of living in a way that they feel the most empowered and safe in an environment that embraces, welcomes, and cares for them. I don't know if you want me to bring my recommendations up now or later.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. I'm not sure if I've gone over. I'm quite a chatty person, which I'm sure you'll all find when you meet me in person, hopefully. So first of all, I think it's important that as a sector, we are proactive. That means being prepared to engage with, and that's not only just like sign up to this event, you went to like this cool Wonkhe event and that's like your purgatory done. It's about like properly engaging with, being curious, like asking questions and actively getting involved in Black-led initiatives. I think that also means opening your purses. You've probably seen that on Twitter a lot. Open your purses and fund these initiatives and look at how you can tangibly provide resources, whether it's through rooms or through, I don't know, funding campaigns. There's so many things you can do. And on this point, I think it's important that you listen to your student union officers because they're the perfect bridge to getting, you know, the solutions on the table and actually showing UN students what's feasible to be done. Secondly, we need to expand decolonization work outside of just EDI teams. So EDI teams, I'm on your side. Senior management and students and middle and lower management staff all need to be involved in the decolonization work, because decolonization in itself is a transformative process that needs to be institution-wide and not piecemeal. And so we need to be really, really conscious that we do that at all levels of our institutions. And I would recommend that you have some sort of external advice and support in that to keep you accountable to the work you're doing, so you're not just doing what's like comfortable or just like good enough. The final thing I want to say is on a more sort of less tangible level, as a sector, we need to be prepared to be opened up to criticism and being open up to being called out for racism if it's happening at your institution, which I'm sure like nobody's innocent of it. And I think what it needs to be, there's two things. It first of all needs to be humble. You need to be humble in accepting that these are real occurrences that are happening and people have called them out. And I think there needs to be a transparency in acknowledging this and looking to actually, you know, make steps forward in tackling it. And the priority needs to shift away from protecting institutional reputation and move more towards protecting Black students and staff and whistleblowers for racism. And that's really, really key if you really want to see meaningful change at your institutions. It goes to say that I think it's also just like it goes beyond your institutions, and I think there's a responsibility for the sector not to silo itself in this work and really get involved in tackling other race-related issues, whether it's tackling the racialized elements of Prevent and how Prevent has targeted students, to tackling racial abuses on and off campus, and looking at how policing affects different students in different groups in different ways. And I think it's important that we recognize this. That's my spiel intro done. I hope that was all coherent and my fancy words worked. Thank you. Yeah.
No, fantastic as always. You covered a lot of things and some really good, clear, practical steps at the end there. So a lot to unpack. Marilyn, I'm reliably informed that you are back with us and you can hear us.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And I did the introductions, did your introduction earlier. But thank you so much again for taking time out of your day to contribute to this conversation. And yeah, over to you with what you've got to say.
Okay, well, thank you all, and apologies for dropping out earlier, but I had technical issues and therefore I haven't heard the introductions, and I haven't unfortunately heard all of Hilary, but I do know Hilary and I do know the things that she's been saying, and I did hear the first half of the session before the break. So I want to take a moment really to share some ideas around the theme of intersections and around the theme of lived experiences. And from listening to the first section and the last bit that I just heard from Hilary, I know that a lot of these points have been covered and some of them have already been raised. So I'm not going to revisit them in detail now, but what we'll do is we'll unpack them as part of the conversation. So in terms of intersections, we know that they exist, and they meet. Intersections is simply about where things overlap, where things interconnect, and they exist across all levels of the organisation, and universities are no different to that. So Amity's already talked to us and established that actions need to be undertaken at the institutional level. And when we talk about the institutional level, we're talking about the work that happens in departments, the work that happens in faculties and in our schools, the places where all the policies are made and where policies are implemented. And that's about strategic leadership, that's about management. So there's an issue around the strategic leadership and the vision, and about the management in terms of how we implement. So those are 2 pointers that I want to just put in. And then we need to focus on, you know, where things are done. And things are done in the teams, in professional servicing teams, in academic teams, in our classrooms. So I want to focus on the things that we can do at an individual level, at group level, for our students in the everyday work that we do. We need to actually take action to support and to make interventions for colleagues and for students at all points of that learning journey, and just as employees. So taking action is going to require a desire to act. So somewhere in here, and I know that Paulette talked about hearts and minds, we need to have a desire to act, a confidence to act. We need to have knowledge on how to do it, and bravery to be able to do this. And very much so, in terms of being brave, we also have to be looking about then what that means in terms of the support mechanisms to be able to give us the tools that we need to be able to do these things. So we're talking about an organisational shift, a cultural shift. And that, again, as I said, is top down, but I'm going to talk just a bit more on the bottom up. So organisations are made up of people, our universities are making for people. We know that collectively we protest against historical structures, against structural racism, but it's the individuals and it's the groups that can make a difference to things like BAME attainment gaps, BAME awarding gaps. If each of us as colleagues commit to make a difference, then that can be cumulative. So we talked about the issue of language, and I'm positioning this in terms of intersectionality. So I know that when talking to colleagues about how they're going to be involved in and how they grapple with tackling things like racial disparity, racial equality, that they are really uncomfortable with the words and not sure on what words to use and how to kind of approach it. So we know from a very pragmatic response that governments and the HE sector use the term BAME, and we use it as an abbreviation. It's a catch-all. It's a tool to record. It's a tool to monitor ethnicity, to report on significant equity gaps between the different ethnic groups, and to look at things like how different groups are performing in terms of access or non-continuation and assessment and all of those sort of measures that we're all aware of. But we've already heard that this term BAME comes with a lot of warnings. It's something that we should use with caution. So when we're using it in a pragmatic and for tools and for monitoring, you know, that's fine. But we've got to recognise that it's loaded with intersections. When we talk about the B in BAME, we're talking about political Black, Black African, Black Caribbean. What exactly do we mean? When we talk about the A in BAME, are we talking about Asians, all Asians, South Asians, Chinese, Middle Eastern? What about minority ethnics? When we talk about the minority ethnic group, is that only people of colour that we're talking about? Or are we talking about gypsies, Irish travellers, you know, people who would identify as white but would still fit in the BAME box? So when we think about BAME and we talk about intersectionality, we need to know about how these terms came to be. We need to understand the shift in language from coloured to Black, to BME, to BAME. We need to understand that historical context. We need to understand the meaning as to how and why it came to be. But more than that, what's really more important is to know about the lived experiences of the people that these terms respond to or actually refer to. So if we're going to take action, we need to hear from and have represented a range of BAME voices across all levels of the organisation. It's only when we can get the voices of all BAME groups heard, picking up the life and the lived experiences of all BAME groups, that we can start to influence our policy, influence our decisions, and then come up with policies and decisions that are going to impact on the people that need it in the ways that they need it. So it kind of goes without saying that BAMEs are not a homogenous group. And therefore, the whole notion of intersectionality takes on a whole life of its own when we're talking about university and we're talking about how we work with our students. So we know that that BAME group is then sub-stratified into sex and into class and into age and into gender. And that list can go on, you know, disability, sexuality. But then when we think about the data that we hold on our students, intersectionality comes in again. They're commuter students, they're mature students, they're, you know, so each and every time you bring another layer of intersection into it, you have to think, what does it mean for what we do and how we do things? So any solution that we come up with and that we identify is going to have to be nuanced. It's going to have to be adapted to meet the needs of the student population, the staff within the organisations in which you work in. There is no one-size-fits-all model or solution, and there is no silver bullet. But what there is that in terms of recommendations then, and I'll start to bring those in terms of we need to know our students. So I think that one of the recommendations that we all need to commit to is to know our students. We've got to put in the work. We've got to find out about their lived experiences. Who are they? What are their drivers? What are the barriers? What are their aspirations? And then we've got to make sure that our provision and our offer is meeting those, supporting them where they are now for the future. Sorry, where they are now, but also to prepare them to be able to have successful futures and successful lives beyond the university. So we've got to capture that data alongside the data that we keep in the university, and we've got to use that data in a smart way. So my second recommendation is about the use of data. We need to have data that's credible, that isn't contested by staff. So every time you give it to them, they say, oh, but it's not this, it's class, it's not this, it's something else. They've got to understand and use the data and use it in a nuanced way to make sure that they can address the issues that they face on their programs, in their modules with their students. So that's something else that I think that we could follow up. So another one of my recommendations that I would be putting on the table is that you've got to do the work. And Hillary's already said this. It's not something that you look to the champion in the organisation, that you look to the department person who's been given this responsibility, or that you look to the BAME person amongst your staff group and amongst your colleagues. Actually, every time a student turns up to a module, it's new and they have to learn and read and do the work in order to pass it. But if you want to work with your students and making sure that you're putting on an offer and tackling racism and tackling this issue, then you've got to do the work. You need to find out and take on board and, you know, just look at what it is you're going to do. So you can't assume anything about lived experiences. Lived experiences matter, and we've got to look at identifying from that what the actual cause is, and not just pull on sort of solutions which are easy and which touch the sort of symptoms. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to the conversation.
Thank you, Marilyn. A lot that you've covered there chimes with what we've been talking about today. So thank you for that. I'm going to kick off with a question from me, and then throw over to Debbie to see whether we've had anything come through. So if anybody who is listening, please do ask any questions. We've got some time to answer. I think both of you talked on the importance of engaging those students. Hilary, you spoke about the importance of using those safe spaces in order to give Black students the right space and the sort of, in a sense, opportunity to unpack how they're feeling about certain issues before taking them through to the university. I just wanted to know whether you had any kind of examples of good, and Hilary, you touched on them. Marilyn, I know you will have seen them at your institution. What are the good examples of the way in which those voices have been heard, and any kind of practical examples of the way in which people have got to know their students in a level that isn't kind of typical at the moment? And I just sort of add to that very quickly. I think it's important to recognise that historically universities have known their students very well, because they were from a certain part of the population, only sort of 7% of the population were going to university. They were all primarily from a very similar background, so you didn't have to do very much work to get to know them. You get the expansion of higher education, and all of a sudden you have, you know, Black people going to university in large numbers, and the institutions haven't caught up with understanding those experiences in the way that certainly not proportional to the expansion of and the diversification of the sector. So from maybe Hilary, start with you. Any kind of practical ways in which institutions can get to know their students better?
Yeah, I think what me and Marilyn, so we spoke about this, and I think what is really interesting is that I think data is important, and I won't say data isn't important, but I think it's important to actually know students as people. I think right now we're in a world where institutions are growing so fast, and the sector is growing so quickly that it's becoming so depersonalized to knowing your student, that often you'll see students come and go without any interaction. And I think there's a part in really trying to condense and really trying to get to know students in terms of people and personal relationships. I think what's also been helpful is that the example I gave about Black men and Black women talk that goes on at Bristol is important, because there's an element of therapy that is laced throughout it, and having that sort of community therapy means that you are able to find spaces where Black students can be together in a way that isn't draining, but instead it's a space where they can feel validated and empowered and filled up with the confidence and the reassurances that they get from people of their own community. And I think in making that something that is accessible for the university to access, I think it's worked well because it's very non-intrusive in nature. And so the person and the staff member who leads at Bristol has done a very good job in terms of making sure that, you know, it's still sort of in control of students, so students actually feel as partners with the university in delivering that. But it means that that student can also work with the university to pick up on key things that the university will need to implement going forward in tackling racism. I think going back to the point that I made earlier about safe spaces, I don't think there's one sort of like safe space that is perfect. And as I was thinking, that's when I came to the conclusion of feeling that safe spaces are only safe spaces when you empower people to make it their own. And essentially, I think listening is going to be what's key. Sorry, the comments are distracting me. Listening is going to be what's key in all of this. That, like, when you get Black students and Black and Asian and ethnic minority students together, you need to give them the power and autonomy to make that space what they need it to be able to express their shared experiences and lived experiences well. Yeah, I hope that answers that well.
Yes, definitely. And Marilyn, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. From a just from, let's say, the classroom perspective, if I was asking academics to get to know their students, sometimes it's simple things, and it's really difficult, as you've just described, when you've got large lectures and there's no time in the model, there's no flexibility in the model to do these things. But if possible, and these are timetabling things, so this is when it becomes an institutional response as well. But if there's gaps in the room booking, so that if you can arrive to the session 5-10 minutes earlier, so that people can maybe, and let students know that you're always there 5 or 10 minutes earlier. Or if you've got a 2-hour or an hour and a half lecture, that you actually say, well, we're going to last 15 minutes, we're going to have that open to just kind of pick up any issues where there's any learning. You know, if you're asking someone to answer a question, can you just say your name? You know, so I'm Marilyn, and I want to ask you so and so, so that people get to know names and start to see. So some of those little things that you can start thinking about in terms of, you know, managing classroom interactions, but more generally in terms of, we work at Roehampton, we've very much got a model of student as partners, and we're trying to ensure that our student partners are sometimes rewarded for some of the work that they do, because if they're doing the work, then actually they ought to be paid to do that work. And it's not paid necessarily the actual rate of work, but some sort of reward or acknowledgement that time is important and their contributions are important. So that looking at ensuring that students are involved in things like decision making, in enhancement activities, but not just ones which are initiated by the university, but that we do things with the students and for the students and help them to come up with things. So concrete examples for us would be things like, we've worked with, when we worked on our attainment gap project, my colleague and dear friend at Queen Mary's, Dr. Aswan, she worked with a small group of students, and we worked with them as researchers. They undertook research on behalf of the Awarding Gap project. And what they said was that they understood what it was like to be in the classroom. They were the ones that were taking the assessments. And if they were asking staff to vary assessments, to think about alternative forms, then they would be prepared to undertake research around that and be able to say, this could work. Well, have you thought about this? Why don't you try that? So that's a real example of partnership working. Other examples of things like a group of students came to us and said, we really feel that we need some concrete work around sort of mentoring and coaching to help students move on. And they set up our peer mentoring scheme. We worked with them and supported them and helped to establish it and make sure it's part of the system. But it was a student who initiated it, the students that we sent on the external training who came back with the knowledge and then worked with our staff to help to develop it. So we need to create opportunities for staff and students to be able to do those things. And those things take resources, they take time, they need to be recognised, they need to be resourced in terms of, as I said, workloads, whether it be time, whether it be funding, whether it just be space, so that people can come together and do these things. They won't happen if it's just an add-on and it's just something you do in your own time. And then taking on board the point that Hilary's already made, the emotional labour that it carries. One of the things that our students fed back to us in our Attainment Gap project was that part and parcel of taking on the responsibility of doing this and having to talk to academics who maybe be marking their work and tell them that some of the things you're doing are not nice. Some of the things you're doing are not helpful. And we want you to change. We want you to stop. And that's a hard conversation for a young person who's vested and, you know, having to work alongside those colleagues and worried about the impact it might have on their future attainment. But we've had some real good examples of students and staff setting up liaison groups to do things like decolonise the curriculum, and people are beginning to look at how working with students when programs are being revalidated, that student panels are part of that. So lots of small things, very nuanced for the different departments, but very much if the approach is a student as partners one.
That's hugely important, and that labour thing is, you know, it's not just about, you know, remuneration is one thing as well. So they need to be effectively rewarded for that work, but then, you know, are they being supported to deal with lots of the issues that will be coming through? In lots of cases, the students are sort of the funnels for other experiences and having to deal with trauma in a sense for the first time in this sort of way. Debbie,
we're trying to develop leadership training for those students. So we're saying that if you're going to undertake these activities on behalf of the organisation, then to get an additional accreditation, some sort of recognition of that work. So support in terms of welfare and well-being, sometimes finances and sometimes accreditation. So that whole kind of way of working is part and parcel of some of the solutions.
Debbie, have you had any questions?
Yeah, I've got a whole range coming in. I was going to pick up this point, but I think it's been really adequately covered about the kind of, I guess, impact on students of having to kind of, I guess, relive their lived experience, for, you know, in order to inform their institution and the consequence of that. And I think a related question is one that came in at the very beginning, which is what do culturally competent student services look like? What would that mean in practice?
That's a really great question. I think it means in practice doing things in sometimes very non-traditional ways. I think what's been really what's really stood out to me over the past month or so is that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, I remember, like, I haven't not been a student for very long, but, you know, being a sabbatical officer in that time, and being a Black sabbatical officer rather, the trauma that I felt was unbelievable. Like, I don't know if I can ever tell you, I don't know if I can ever properly characterize how traumatic it felt to you know, watch that video, to come into work and to have to deal with issues of race and talking about how it's related to my experience, and sort of try and work through trying to be like professional and dealing with that trauma at that same time. I think in terms of looking at culturally competent care, I want to re-emphasize my point about like community. Community is such a big thing that I think is often underestimated within the Black community, and it goes back to validating people's experiences. I think right now what happened with George Floyd, it was horrible having to watch, you know, him die on video. But I think it created a bigger point of, you know, why does it take us to watch a video of a man being murdered for us to actually believe that these experiences are real? And is that what it takes for us to stop being gaslighted? And I think if we're looking at culturally competent care, it means we're looking at ways of validating those experiences first, and then we look at how we're going to, you know, really acknowledge the experiences for what they are and then tackle them. I think right now we're in a space where, you know, the institutions are talking about culturally competent care's report and support mechanisms, which quite frankly, I don't know if I've come across a genuinely robust one in terms of reporting racism. I think as a sector, we have so many ways of reporting complaints for all sorts of issues, but race is something that has a big gap in the sector at the moment in being able to report about. And I think if we're going to look at that, we need to be able to find a way of like, you know, really finding ways of validating those experiences, acknowledging them, reporting them, and giving the actual trauma support and well-being support for Black students to be able to heal from that. And that's not just a few counselling sessions, that's a whole sort of course and a real redemptive action from institutions and perpetrators to show that they're moving forward and trying to push forward from carrying out those incidences and promoting the structures that continue to allow racism to persist.
Marilyn, I think this is one for you. I mean, there's been some strides in the wider policy environment, and we've had people talking in the chat box about the kind of the incentives on institutions to, to take action across the institution. So we've got the Race Equality Charter, we've got access and participation plans, and TEF data kind of breaks down differential student outcomes. How much of an influence is that? Is that the right way to proceed?
Yeah, I actually think that having some formal structures and building this whole area into what we do as our everyday business and trying not to make it something on top of is going to be one way to make sure that people participate and see it as part of their daily work. So I think things like the access and participation plan is crucial. The targets in that plan should be known and owned by everybody in the university. Everybody should know what it is that the university is working towards, what their gaps are, and what targets, what action plans are in place to achieve those targets. I think that the Race Equality Charter should be mandatory. Everybody should do it, it should have teeth, and it should actually be merged with, badged with, alongside the access and participation plan, so that organisations see the need. And I know that I totally agree, I'm very much a people-centred and wanting to talk to real people in real lives, but we can use that data to also help the situation. So for example, at a module level, if you know what is happening with your students, so whether it be their feelings and their responses to the NSS, the TEF data that you have, that you know what your targets are in relation to access and participation plan, and you've got real data. So for example, you've got a group and you know, for example, that group are students who maybe came in through one qualification form rather than another, students who are predominantly living off campus and commuting, and you know something about your students, you might then be able to start thinking about what are the specifics that I need to do. So for example, if you want to increase student outcomes in terms of our BAME students and getting 2-1s and first degrees, then you might want to say, well, how many BAME students have we got who are averaging top 50s, bottom two, top 2-2 marks? And if we know we've got a bundle of students who are top 2-2, how do we get them over that boundary? What is it that they need? Are there some specific things that can be put in for a specific group of students? So the data will allow you to do some of those things, but I agree, it's definitely not the answer to everything. So one of the projects that we did at Roehampton was that we anonymised 5,000 data sets on our students in terms of ethnicity. And what we did was we said, well, if we take ethnicity and look at, for example, their engagement and participation, and then we add on to it things like what happens if we keep ethnicity constant and add on commuting, and then add on whether or not they live on an off-site, add on what their religion is, add on their social class, add on all of those kinds of things. Does it make a difference in terms of the students who do well or not? And what we found was even when we took everything into account, all those intersectionalities, there was still a differential for race and ethnicity. And if that differential still exists, then it's got to be something that we're doing, because we're filtering out all of those kind of social things and those things that people say, it must be because the students are poor, it must be because the students live far away, it must be because they've got caring responsibilities. So if you take all of that out, what's left? So the data then gives you the imperative, and that's why I say clean data, credible data, that staff don't have to keep saying, oh, it's got to be wrong, we don't believe it, we don't trust it, it's not us, it's them, needs to be on the table.
Absolutely. Hilary, one final one to you. We've had a question about the role of the SU in holding institutions accountable, and obviously this is something that you're extremely close to. But actually, we've had another question, which I think, which is about online platforms, because obviously our context is that we're doing everything online right now. And it's, you know, and it's challenging for SUs to, you know, to do their work in that context. So and particularly in the context of what you were talking about, you know, forging communities and bringing people together, creating those safe spaces. Is that possible online? Do SUs have a role in that? And what's the kind of role of SUs on accountability more generally? And all in 1 minute, please.
That's fine. That's a great question. I think first of all, the role of SUs in talking about like calling out racism, I think it's less about the role of the SUs, because I think SUs do it really, really effectively. I think it's more about institutions and how they take that call out. And I think often institutions get called out by their SUs for racism, and it's met with a shutdown to access to senior management, to meetings, to being involved in projects. And I think institutions need to think really, really hardly about, you know, how prepared are they, like, in my opinion, I think it's better you get called out by your union than you get called out by you know, in a way that will shame you a lot more publicly and in a way that would hurt you a lot more. And so I think if you're not prepared to hear from your unions, then there's something wrong inside that you really need to tackle to really understand what it means to call out racism and how important it is that you take that. I think secondly, in talking about building communities online, I think it is a challenge for us, but I think it can be done. I think we need to be fun in the sector. We need to do things that are different and that are weird sometimes. Over the past few months, I found so many book clubs. I found so many people starting plant families. I've become a plant mum recently, and now I don't kill plants. You know, like, I think there's so many ways you can get people into communities without it feeling so stoic and rigid, it having a set purpose for what you want them to do and what you want them to achieve and feed back to you. And so, like, I guess the quickest thing for me to say is just have fun with it. Be fun, be innovative. Just don't make it so prescriptive that it's inaccessible, and you'll do fine.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, conscious of time, and we've had a fantastic discussion. Thank you again, Hilary and Marilyn, for joining us. A delight as always, and I'm sure people will be in touch to invite you to other events as well to talk about these issues. But thank you so much for taking your time. Good to see you both. And now we move on to our final session of the day, which is about leadership. Who are the leaders and what are their responsibilities? I'm really pleased that Professor Randall Whitaker can join us today for this last session. Please do stick with us for the last half an hour. Professor Whitaker is Pro Vice Chancellor academic at Leeds College of Art. He was born in South Africa and trained as a musician in conservatoires in Africa, the Netherlands and the Czech Republic. He has extensive experience as a senior manager within specialist professional education and has a strong interest in equality, diversity and inclusion. So really lucky to have you with your extensive experience here with us today. So this session is about leadership. As we know, there are very few Black and BME senior leaders in higher education, and that too has a knock-on effect on the outcomes for staff and students. So Randall, keen to hear your reflections on this and from your experience as well.
Thank you, Amate, and thank you, everyone. It's always difficult when you are the last speaker in an event, especially with one with such eloquent and articulate speakers before you. So many of the key points I have addressed, they have covered. So I have to take a slight different approach to not be too repetitive. However, I will start off by saying that university structures are complex. And for the purpose of this talk, I use senior leadership to refer to those individuals in powerful decision-making positions. So think about that in the academic sphere, in professional services, the executive, and of course, governance. The lack of Black people at university senior leadership level is lamentable.
we are still dehumanized and demonized by the color of our skin, and phrases like a lack of pipeline is used to explain away inaction. It is inexcusable that our universities have so few people with lived experience at senior leadership level. The seemingly unwillingness and lack of collective accountability to address this lack of representation provides the perfect environment for toxic racism to thrive. In the absence of experienced or of lived experience white leaders, they need to reflect on the privileges they enjoy because they are white, and think through how they can use their privilege to address systemic racism. In the absence of lived experience, senior leaders, white senior leaders, must have empathy for and show an understanding of the Black lived experience. It is not the responsibility of Black people to educate white people about race. White leaders must take individual responsibility to educate themselves. Stop asking Black people to do so. Conversation about racial injustice is complex and difficult, but essential. As a senior leader, you must be forensic in examining, understanding, and addressing the racism within your university. Do the claims of tolerance and commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion make your policies stack up? How effective is your rolling equality, diversity, and inclusion training and development programs? How do you measure its impact? What is going wrong in your periodic review or course approval processes for your curriculum still to be white? Do you understand that advancement for some cis white women is not evidence that your university or senior leadership team or governing body is diverse? Are you listening to and hearing directly from Black students, Black staff, and Black governors? Do not make hypocritical and superficial statements about addressing racism. Read the room, as you will have completely missed the point of the present moment. Black people have heard it all before because our life experiences have been tinted with racism. As a senior leader, you must do the work. Make the significant structural changes required for your university to become anti-racist. You must become actively anti-racist through your actions. Anti-racism is not policy. It is a set of values and principles against which to measure all work. A commitment to execute visible changes addressing race equality is no longer good enough. You must be accountable for it. I would also like to briefly talk about the acronym BAME, which all the speakers have addressed. So here is my brief take on this. Homogenizing BAME is not only lazy, but also problematic. Who exactly are you talking about when you use it? BAME has no nuance, and its use impacts the lives of people, of Black people negatively. Asian is not the same as Black. BAME is being used to gaslight the Black experience and mask inaction. As a senior leader, you must take responsibility for challenging and checking language. Stop using BAME. Say Black when you mean Black. In response to addressing racism in your university, or if your response to addressing racism in your university is yet more mandatory diversity training, please stop and rethink. As a senior leader, you must acknowledge the limitation of diversity and inclusion training programs. The mandatory 2-hour unconscious bias or diversity training program has not made your university anti-racist. You must make the significant structural changes required to do so. Not making these structural changes preserves the status quo. The racism remains. Being aware of racism does not fix racism. Now that the momentum of the Black Lives Matter protests and the social media outrage has been lost, will you be speaking out against racism? Will you still be an ally? Remember, you can do better. Keep the conversation going. As a senior leader, you must not be silent or defensive about racism. Do not get involved in the woke washing of racism. Be sincere, be honest. Being transparent about where you are and where you need to be is a strength, not a weakness. Now is the time for university senior leaders to use their platform to take meaningful action against racism. Thank you, Amate.
Thank you, Randall. A lot to unpack there, and really interested in particularly the comments you had to say about the homogenization of the experience. There's some stuff that we'll be keen to unpack around unconscious bias training and diversity training, as you highlighted. But first, I had a question about what you mentioned right at the beginning about that pipeline. Typically, and I'm sure others on this call will know this pipeline better than me, but you know, you do your undergrad, master's, PhD, junior researchship. You then you might be made get an internal role in the department, head of school, PVC. Then you know you get onto the senior team, and then vice chancellor, and I'm sure there are lots of other ways of doing that. Look where we are today. The sort of vice chancellors from today would have done that, but started back years and years ago, at a time when the sector looked very, very different. So, and I understand what you said in terms of people looking at that and going, well, there are no people coming through the system, so it's understandable that it's that. What thoughts do you have about actually completely sort of, in a sense, tearing that up and saying, well, if that pipeline's not going to produce us with the diverse talent that we need, we're going to have to find another way of doing it, or we're going to have to short circuit that traditional model, because even if we were to start fixing the first part of the pipeline today, we're not going to see that until 50, 60 years time. So what are your thoughts on kind of, in a sense, shortcutting that pipeline to make sure we get diverse talent onto senior teams?
Yes, well, I mean, I think the first thing to say, Amate, is from my perspective, that talent is there. It exists. It's about how you get to those individuals. So let's talk about university governance and appointment panels in terms of senior posts and how that typically works in our university sector. That there will be an appointment panel made up of a selection of your board, perhaps a few students from the SU included, but typically universities in the UK commission executive search companies to undertake this work. Executive search companies in the UK, in terms of their work with universities in particular, sign up to a voluntary code of conduct. So there are very few of them. Minerva is one good example that is absolutely open and transparent about their data. How many applications from Black individual, how many have made it to the long list, how many have made it to the short list, how many appointed. That lack of transparency within the other executive search firms is a real problem, because you cannot see what is happening through all those various stages, how many people actually make it through the long list from applications. So there's an inherent bias, and I've been vocal about this before. I find it lamentable that as universities, we should be using agencies that sign up to a voluntary code of conduct. So governing bodies are risk averse, quite rightly so. Risk averse people are easily led to make safe decisions. I'm not saying that is universally the case, but we have got to ask the question that within the amount of universities we have in this country, wide, diverse, etc., and I mean diverse in sense of curriculum, that why are we in a situation that there are so few Black people in senior leadership positions? That starts with looking at how you conduct your appointment and recruitment of those particular staff.
That's a really important point, because there is that distinction then, obviously, between the internal appointments for positions which are a bit sort of lower down in the food chain, as it were, but actually, yeah, that point about when senior leaders are appointed, the executive search companies are their support is sought for, and then what are they doing? The lack of transparency about that process, and often targeting existing pools that they may have, and similar for governors' appointments as well. External agencies are used, and how diverse are they? And has that conversation been had about with them about this agenda? I think is important.
Yes, and I do think, Amate, there are questions for the regulator to ask themselves here as well. What are they doing about this particular situation? So we have this vast regulation across all aspects of the work of universities, but when it comes to making senior appointments that, to use your phrase, that have capabilities, and then to use Paulette's phrase, that can understand the urgency of the situation, there is silence. I'm not asking for a condition of registration, but I'm asking and pleading to for someone to listen. Why are universities allowed to use executive search companies that sign up to a voluntary code of conduct? It's not acceptable.
That's a really important point. Debbie, I wondered whether we have any questions coming through at all.
Absolutely. There's a basket of questions about training. And Randall, you said you were quite clear about the kind of issues with delivering lots of training to kind of raise awareness. And actually, Amate, you mentioned earlier that you feel that there's quite an important distinction to be made away from unconscious bias and towards racial equity. But I think there's also throughout the chat, it's been clear that to some extent the problem is whiteness. It's white privilege. It's a lack of understanding among white people, or a lack of confidence sometimes about what our role is and what we should be doing, and an ability to recognize this, and an ability to take action. And while I'm really conscious that I shouldn't present this to you as a question for you to solve, but there's quite if training has sort of serious limitations, could you comment on that further? But also, are there things that white people can be doing to be better ourselves?
Yes, I think I've been quite emphatic that I'm not here to train, but I can see some of the chats popping up, and it is about the right kind of training. Who does it? Specialist training by specialist people with experience can be more effective. But as senior leaders and as individuals, we have got to recognize the limitation, because often we sit doing it online, or sit in the seminar room, have someone talk at you for 2 hours, maybe less. And then the idea is that you use that knowledge and apply it. Well, actually, sometimes you don't have the ability to apply it. And then crucially, very few institutions measure the impact because they don't know how to measure the impact of the training. And I'm not quite sure. I think I come probably from the school of thought that says you can't train unconscious bias. You can't train bias out of people. You need to learn how to live with it. I understand completely that that's not helpful for someone asking, well, what does effective training look like? I think some of the best examples of effective training in terms of equality and diversity, and if you want to include bias in that, please do, are those led by people with lived experiences, giving some of the participants engaging at the training the opportunity to engage at that level, to hear how it manifests itself in lots of different ways. So yes, I do not have the question to this. I know in my own institution, I look very carefully at what that program looks like, what we can do better, who can deliver it, are we using the right people, are we measuring it? You know, these programs are a huge investment for many universities. I don't have the answers to that. I'm highlighting that as senior leaders, we should realize the limitations, and we need to do better.
Thank you. Amate, do you want to pick up on that question about bias versus equity?
Yes, and this comes from my own experience actually of doing some race equity training when I was at NUS, and it was the first time I'd been engaged in a process, and obviously it was split out, so the non-white staff and white staff had different sessions, but I think coming down, it comes down to as Randall said, having somebody with the experience and being able to hear those experiences and the ways in which they manifest themselves, how it made the individuals feel, act, and that sense, particularly in the university context, how it made them feel in terms of them being part of the university community. And you can't do that through a sort of through a sort of survey or online kind of form sort of thing. Unconscious bias training sometimes just sort of tells you that you have biases and then doesn't really tell you what to do about it. Whereas actually this is about understanding and getting a greater insight on experiences, reflecting then on your own behaviors, and then ideally, hopefully, making you more aware and in tune to the way in which your behaviours may influence others, so that you can then change. And as Paulette said earlier, obviously that's not the only thing you do. If an individual goes through that process and it completely ignores it, there needs to be sanctions if that behaviour continues, and you have robust processes as well. But it's far more than just you know. And the other thing is as well, is that individuals are from different at different levels of their education and understanding. So you need somebody with the expertise who understands how to, potentially in a, for want of a better word, a mixed ability group, how you can sort of educate people in a sensitive way when, you know, people will say things which are offensive and make mistakes. How do you get them by the end of the sessions to understand what the issues are?
If I just quickly, briefly say that I think there is also evidence that suggests if you make it voluntary, unconscious bias training, for example, those people who are really serious about it will step forward. So you have a more attentive group to work with, and they can then become influencers for it. I think it's the mandatory position that I have issues with, because, you know, it can be used as a tick box exercise. 100% of staff at University X has undertaken mandatory unconscious bias training. Therefore, we are non-racist, we are anti-racist. Well, absolute nonsense. You know, it doesn't work like that.
Yes. Any other questions, Debbie?
Yeah, we've been having some questions, I guess, people who are not in formal positions of leadership, and you know, people who have less power, and I think we're talking about both white and black people here, and people of colour who want to kind of influence, want to try and make a difference, want to be a leader in their own context, should we say, but there's not an obvious route to being part of the decision-making conversation. Are there things that those people can be doing?
Gosh, Debbie, an absolute excellent question. And I might say to members who have joined this webinar that it's not easy. You know, I have to recognize my privilege to be one of very few senior university leaders from the background that I am in. It has been really difficult to get there, and actually it has taken me a long time to be as emphatic as I am now. It is about confidence, it's about using your platform to address the right things. I also did not join the academy to be a token representative for advancing Black leadership in universities. No, actually, I joined it as a musician, believe it or not. But I think there are ways in which structures can help staff in those positions to feel that they can challenge, that they can question. I think a really important point is by acknowledging that we don't all get it right all the time, and that is fine. You know, we will make mistakes. Conversations about race are difficult and actually at most times probably awkward as well. So the worst thing you can do is to not have them. But some of the previous speakers have given some excellent tips about what to look for, how you can go about asking questions. I think, you know, there has to be a confidence in asking the question. There has to be a sense that you're feeling listened to. You know, even now I question how much I get listened to, but I'm certainly not silent anymore. But it has taken me a long time to get there.
I'm sure, yeah, as you sort of touched on, the challenges with so few, it's I doubt there's some sort of network even,
Well,
you know, be sort of 3 or 4 people across the sector. So, you know,
yes. I mean, I often feel when I enter a boardroom or a conference in the old normal we used to have, and I also think, oh goodness, I'm going to have to be the only person again that asks the question about the diverse senior leadership because there is no one else in the room. But actually, I might want to ask a question about something else. I do owe it to colleagues from Black backgrounds and students from Black backgrounds to see that there are people, a few, but there are people who are comfortable to raise these questions.
And yeah, as you said, not wanting to be kind of typecast as the person who's going to talk about race so that nobody else has to say anything.
Wash their hands.
Yeah, indeed. Debbie, are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's some questions about resourcing here, and I think there's a sort of layer to this, which is about government, and obviously the Chancellor is making his big speech this morning, and we're expecting some of the, the purse strings to be loosened, but also at the institutional level, how to convince senior leaders to make the resource available, and it's something that's been a theme throughout the event.
Yes.
Do we need to be asking for more of that?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Someone asked the question, I think either in person or in the chat, or it might have even been Marilyn actually addressing it, the Race Equality Charter versus Athena Swan, for example. And just very quickly from me, Athena Swan was excellent in terms of providing opportunity for white middle-class women. Part of the impetus to take it really seriously from university leaders was that some aspects of it was linked to aspects of funding. So we have got to be clear about that. So there is an impetus when there's another pot of money available for something. A pot of money isn't the answer to this. If we are going to see change, each university leader and its governing body needs to make those structural changes. No amount of throwing additional money from the public purse is going to improve it, because you need the individuals to act to do it. There's inaction, there's excuses. These things we're talking about today, we've been talking about for a very, very long time. Use your budgeting processes in a different way. Commit some of those money you spend somewhere else on something like this. Show your students, show your staff how important it is to you. Work beyond the statements, work beyond the media statements, the press releases, the social media releases. Take action, but be accountable for it yourself. You do not need government to tell you how to do this. It's an excuse.
Well, I think that's a very, very good place for us to wrap up today. That real call for action, not waiting for the government to tell us what to do, and certainly not waiting for the government to tell us to put in place regulations which don't quite work for us, actually to take the initiative is a lesson certainly for today. Randall, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Really interested to hear your views from your experience on this. Thank you to all our speakers as well for engaging in today's debate. Thank you to Wonkhe as well, from me personally, for allowing a platform for these conversations to be had. This is, certainly one of the biggest online events in higher education on this topic that I've ever seen. So this is really encouraging. And obviously, thank you to everybody who I imagine is working from home. Thank you to all of you for engaging. Please do keep the conversation going. Please do keep thinking about, reflecting on how you can take action, and please keep the conversation going online, social media, in the workplace, and elsewhere. So I think that is all from me, but I hope you all have a good rest of the day.
And thank you all, and thank you so much, Amate, for hosting an absolutely brilliant event once we got up and running. Thank you, Randall, for your absolutely inspiring comments, and thank you to all of you for everything you've contributed in the chat. I've been noting down everything you've said, and I'm going to try and bring it all together and share those resources. As we promised, the recording and the slides will be available after the event. And if somehow this is your first encounter with Wonkhe, then do stay in touch with us. Sign up to our Monday briefing, which is free. Read our website, and if you are a member at a subscribing institution, you can get our daily briefing as well. We'll keep the conversation going. Have a wonderful day. Thank you again, and let's make the change.
Thanks.